Very quickly, the call went out that the gunman who had apparently shot up the Port Arthur historic site was now laying siege from the Seascape Cottage. Once night fell, the Special Operations Group were encroaching upon the property and they were spotted by the gunman who was calling himself Jamie. There was a conversation where he said, "I could see one of your boys coming up on the northeast corner and I've got this scope and he's going to shoot your main man." So there's some question as to how the shooter managed to obtain a night vision scoped rifle and why he did not shoot the police. If we're talking about a person that went down to Port Arthur and basically killed men, women and children, why would he not shoot the police? Police were shot at, but there were no police officers that were injured or killed as a result of the siege at the Seascape Cottage. Welcome to the Wasp Files. Some of this material may be distressing and viewer discretion is advised. The Seascape Cottage, which was a pleasant little pink-coloured Airbnb cottage that was down near the water's edge, some kilometres from the Port Arthur historical site, was always intended to be, if you like, the main headquarters for the planning and initial assault on the Port Arthur historic site itself. The cottage was owned by two elderly owners, David and Sally Martin. Martin Bryant had had some interactions with them. There's a lot of reports that there was a grudge there. Martin's father, Maurice, firstly, had wanted to purchase some property that the Martins owned and that he was not given any permission to do that, and that had made him depressed and consequently may have contributed to his suicide many months later. Martin Bryant also, once he'd inherited quite a lot of money, had made apparently an offer to buy the Seascape Cottage and been told, doesn't matter how much money you've got, Martin, we'll never sell it. This is all unsubstantiated. It was put out there to basically explain that the reason why the Martins were killed and their Seascape Cottage was used as the location for the siege that took place after the massacre at the Port Arthur historic site was because that Martin had a grudge against the owners and apparently had described them as, Sally Martin, as one of the meanest people that I've met. Once again, this has to be determined. It's all very well to make these kind of claims, but without a coronial inquest and an open trial and a detailed examination of these events and even speaking to the convicted perpetrator himself, Martin Bryant, we'll never know for sure. But the fact remains that at the beginning of the massacre that occurred on the 28th of April 1996, apparently the Seascape Cottage was the site of the first two murders. Neighbours nearby had tendered witness statements that between 10:30 and 11 a.m. they had heard shots emanating from the vicinity of the Seascape Cottage. This was not considered to be unusual because, being a rural community, many people own firearms and, people would shoot rabbits and so on. But neighbours had reported that between that time frame there were shots that had come from the Seascape area. This has been reported as evidence that Martin Bryant had attended the Seascape Cottage and shot the two owners and then set the cottage up in preparation for the final siege that would take place after the rest of the assault had taken place at the Port Arthur historic site. In terms of the firearms that may have been either transported to the Seascape Cottage or already been in existence there is a lot of mystery and confusion about that. Glenn Martin, who was the son of David and Sally Martin, reportedly owned firearms and used to shoot beer cans off his boat in the bay. Purportedly he had an SKK or an SKS semi-automatic rifle and perhaps other firearms as well, but that hasn't really been determined. All that they know is that once the siege had ended at the Seascape Cottage, there were firearms that were recovered, burnt in the wreckage, other than those owned purportedly by Martin Bryant, and that there was something like 17 firearms that were found incinerated in the ashes of the fire. But Seascape Cottage presents somewhat of a mystery. There are some oddities concerned with the activities that took place both before the Port Arthur shooting and after, during the activities of the siege. So in the morning, following the reports of the gunshots that were heard from the Seascape Cottage, Mr. and Mrs. Mason, who were a tourist couple, had apparently pulled into the drive at Seascape. They tendered witness statements because they wanted to have a look inside the cottage. It was such a pretty location and they were considering staying there. They wanted to have a look at it. They reported that a young blonde-haired male had exited in a somewhat agitated state, and they asked whether they could attend the interior of the cottage, and he said, "No, you can't, my girlfriend's sleeping, you should go away, I reckon you should go away." They were concerned enough by his behaviour to withdraw. They did state that there was a yellow Volvo parked in front of the cottage as well. So there was a witness statement that a blonde-haired male was present at the Seascape Cottage prior to the Port Arthur shooting and had acted in such a way as to prevent them from gaining any further access to the interior of the cottage. Following the reported incidents at the cottage, we know that the gunman then drove down supposedly along the access routes, stopping at various points along the way before ending up at the Port Arthur historic site where the mainstay of the shooting took place, before commandeering the gold BMW after shooting the occupants and making his way back to the Seascape Cottage. The BMW was driven onto the Seascape property with a hostage in the boot who had been kidnapped at one of the nearby service stations. That hostage, supposedly, according to police reports, was brought into the Seascape Cottage and handcuffed to the stairrail. There were reports that vehicles that were travelling down towards the Port Arthur historic site were fired upon from the driveway entrance of the Seascape Cottage. There was some indication that at least 4 or 5 vehicles were fired upon, with people being injured, vehicles being immobilised. And there were reports that the shooter was a blonde-haired young male. There was also one report that the shooter appeared to have mousy-coloured hair with a beard and wearing a flannelette shirt, who had also fired upon vehicles. What happened then was that once the aftermath of the Port Arthur shooting had taken place and the time frame was that they were entering into the later afternoon, because the shooting took place at 1:30 p.m, that police had received reports of a burning vehicle at Seascape, and that also that the shooter had fired from the side of the road on vehicles. There were 2 police officers that were the first on the scene at the Seascape Cottage. These were Constables Paul Hyland and Constable Gary Whittle. They approached the Seascape entrance and made witness statements that they had seen the BMW, which was parked on the grounds of the cottage, on fire and emitting smoke, quite a large column of smoke. They were fired upon from an individual or individuals in the cottage and then withdrew to safe vantage points where they still had the ability to observe the property, but at a safer distance rather than being in clear sight of whoever was shooting at them. Very shortly after, a Special Operations Group officer by the name of Andrew Fogarty had attended. They were surprised at how quickly he had arrived on the scene. And there was basically an attempt to block the access roads to prevent any further civilians or vehicles driven by being shot at. Very quickly the call went out that the gunman who had apparently shot up the Port Arthur historic site was now laying siege from the Seascape Cottage. So the activities of the police, who had remained sequestered at Tirana for something like 6 hours before they attended the shooting scene at Port Arthur, were now converging upon the Seascape Cottage as the potential location for the shooter. Pat Allen was another police officer who also attended and very quickly became fired upon by somebody from within the cottage and had to take refuge next to his vehicle, and bullets apparently were striking the front bonnet of the car, close enough for him to consider that to be dangerous. For quite a while, Constable Pat Allen was pinned down in a culvert along with other officers while they were being fired upon, and there were reports that bullets were quite close to them, whizzing through the air and striking vegetation behind them. So in essence, the police were pinned down. This is the constables that had attended the scene. There were reports also from some of the oddities from the siege, which once again to this day have never been explained. Both constables Gary Whittle and Paul Hyland reported a naked, dark-haired, screaming female running between the guest house and the cottage. Now, this person has never been identified, and given that the police reports and in the court pre-trial hearing, Damien Bugg basically suggested that the Martins, who were an elderly couple, Sally Martin had greying hair, were shot sometime earlier in the morning between 10:30 and 11, then the identity of the naked, dark-haired, screaming woman has never been determined. Who that was, we don't know, but it was clearly evidenced and in witness statements by those two constables. So that was one of the odd occurrences that hasn't been explained. Very quickly, the Special Operations Group, some of which had been flown in from the mainland, had come from New South Wales and Victoria, and teamed up with the Tasmanian Special Operations Group, had formed a perimeter around the Seascape Cottage, and basically were very aware and reporting that there was multiple shots being fired from the cottage. The interesting notion of that is that there were police reports initially that there were multiple shooters. There were reports that different firearms were being discharged at different times and from different locations, that lights were being turned off and on, this is when it got darker, from the Seascape Cottage. And of course this could be a tactic to give the impression that there were more than one shooter in the Seascape Cottage, but further events seem to suggest that there was more than one shooter. I spoke at great length to Terry McCarthy. Terry McCarthy was the police negotiator that was called in to try and make contact with the shooter at the Seascape Cottage. Prior to his engagement, a journalist had, just on the off chance, contacted the Seascape Cottage trying to get information about what was occurring in Port Arthur, and the phone was answered by someone who was calling themselves Jamie. They were responding in a sort of an unusual and taunting way, and then finished off apparently the conversation by saying, "If you call again, I'll shoot the hostages." This reporter then passed that information on to police, and then a phone line was established so Terry McCarthy, police negotiator, could talk to the occupant of the Seascape Cottage that was holding siege and firing upon the police. Terry confirmed to me, and he said in witness statements as well, that the conversation he had was with an individual who called himself Jamie. And it was an odd conversation. He said he wasn't acting like someone who had just taken part in a mass shooting. He said the conversation was weird. At one point he said it was like he was reading from a script. There are transcripts of that full conversation. I have some of those. But also there are audio recordings of the telephone conversation between Jamie and Terry McCarthy.
Oh, hello.
It's Terry again. How are you?
I'm fine.
How's things going in there, mate?
Fine, couldn't be better. Just like on a Hawaiian holiday.
Hawaiian holiday?
Yes, that's correct, sir.
Oh, I'm sorry, I don't understand what you mean by that.
I don't know myself, no.
And one of the interesting aspects of that was that whilst Jamie was talking to Terry, he was saying, "I'm going to make a cup of tea and some sandwiches for the hostages, and I've got to go because the kettle is squealing downstairs," having an amiable conversation about in essence taking care of the needs of the supposed hostages. Remember at this point that Glenn Pearce had been supposedly taken into the cottage and handcuffed to the stair railing. Whilst this conversation was taking place, clearly there are gunshots that are heard in the background.
I'm making up some sandwiches. These people have got salad and some bacon in the
Right.
fish and eggs. I'm going to fry up some bacon and eggs for them.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, I've got to go because this kettle's squealing downstairs, and I'm making a cup of tea now for the hostages.
There was something like 20 gunshots. These were described and explained away by the police as being coughs in the transcripts. And as you can see by the panel, there are quite a few of these. They were later independently verified to be shots from an SKS semi-automatic rifle. So somebody was shooting whilst Jamie, who was Martin Bryant, supposedly, was having an amiable conversation with the police negotiator. It's an odd interaction, but the gunshots can be clearly heard. There were reports by some of the Special Operations Group snipers that had taken up positions around the cottage that at one point they could see a blonde-haired male on the roof of the cottage who was stationary, and this occurred whilst there were other shots being heard, that person was literally lying prone on the roof of the cottage. Later there were reports that helicopters that were flying over the Seascape Cottage had been fired upon and were advised to divert away. But some of these snipers had the shooter in their sights. They were asking for permission to engage and were not given that permission. Reports by Special Operations Group sniper Sierra was that he had the shooter in his sights and asked for permission to engage, and apparently the directive came back, do not engage, this has to happen. Apparently, and it's yet to be confirmed, that 2 Australian federal police officers resigned after hearing that call. Some of the command police were basically explaining that they felt the situation was too dangerous for them to be able to storm the Seascape Cottage, and that they were concerned about hostages, hence the direction not to engage and basically neutralise the shooter, which I consider to be an unusual direction, given that if the person was clearly identified as being a solitary gunman from the Port Arthur historic site, that if they had the chance to take him out, that should have occurred. There was another report from the sniper that they were seeing a silhouetted figure through the mesh screen of one of the doors and had the opportunity to once again engage and neutralise, and did not do so. So this occurred into the night. An unusual development was that once night fell, the Special Operations Group, some of which were dressed in black, were encroaching upon the property, and they were spotted by the gunman who was calling himself Jamie in Seascape. And Jamie was saying that he could see them, that he had, in essence, night vision equipment on a rifle that he had. And he could see, there was a conversation where he said, I could see one of your boys coming up on the northeast corner, and I've got this scope, and he's going to shoot your main man. Can you tell him to move back? Terry McCarthy was on the phone and said, yes, we don't want anyone shot, we don't want to hurt you, I will call him back.
Yes, hello, how are you?
I'm very well, thanks, Jamie. Yourself?
Well, I'm well up till now, in the past few 20 seconds. What I've actually found out, man, is that one of your boys is right outside, northeast, I'd say, with an infrared scope. Will you just ask him to move on?
Oh, we'll do that. We'll do that now.
Is he going to shoot? He's going to shoot your main man.
So there's some question as to how the shooter managed to obtain a night vision scoped rifle and why he did not shoot the police. If we're talking about a person that went down to Port Arthur and basically killed men, women and children indiscriminately with impunity, why would he not shoot the police? Police were shot at, but there were no police officers that were injured or killed as a result of the siege at the Seascape Cottage. Given that he had night vision equipment that is quite unusual because he certainly had the resources to be able to do so. There were other incidences where the communication between Terry McCarthy and Jamie had some interesting observations. Jamie was referring to someone else in the cottage by the name of Rick. Rick has often been the name that has been used to accuse Tasmanian Special Operations Group Michael Rick Dyson, who was a police officer I've spoken to quite regularly in regards to the claims by many that he was the second shooter at the Seascape Cottage, or one of the shooters at Seascape Cottage. A claim which he, of course, vehemently denies, but he was accused of being Rick. Jamie went on to say to Terry McCarthy that he knew Rick well, that he'd shot with Rick, and that he knew Rick's wife. He also mentioned to Terry McCarthy that Rick's wife was high up above your position, and Terry McCarthy had replied, what do you mean by that? I don't know what you mean by that. And he said, you know, in intelligence, which is an unusual thing to say. So the role, if you like, that the gunman seemed to be playing was that there was additional people in the Seascape Cottage with him, and that one of these was a person called Rick. One of the young police officers apparently at the command centre was overheard these conversations and was asked, who's Rick? And was told, no, Rick's the hostage. So there is confusion about who was in that cottage and supposedly who the identity of these other people were. At daybreak, the cottage itself caught fire. It was alleged that Martin Bryant, who was calling himself Jamie, had set the cottage on fire. And he had run out initially dressed in black, so there'd been a change of clothing. So the shooter who'd exited the Port Arthur site had been wearing light-coloured pants, white sneakers and a light blue shirt and a dark three-quarter coat. When Martin did actually exit the Seascape Cottage prior to the fire, he was seen dressed in black. Apparently a firearm was discharged, which was a short firearm, which some thought might have been a handgun. There was no such mention of how Martin might have obtained a handgun, nor any records of a handgun being used, and then ran back into the Seascape Cottage. The cottage was on fire at this point. Following that, shortly after, an individual ran out dressed in black with blonde hair on fire. His back was on fire. He ran out into the grounds, was seen removing the burning clothing, and basically that was at that point that the Special Operations Group closed in with ballistic shields and arrested the person at gunpoint and held them to the ground. They maced him in the face, and that was reported to be Martin Bryant, and one of the Special Operations Group said, quote, he was grinning and out with the fairies. So Martin Bryant was definitely arrested at the Seascape Cottage. There is some confusion about the reason why he was taking the pseudonym Jamie. During the conversations with Terry McCarthy, Terry was trying to ascertain the identity of the gunman, and the gunman wouldn't tell him. And at some point, Terry McCarthy asked him, well, can you tell us your passport number? And Jamie rattled off the passport number that was Martin Bryant's. He said, I know it so well because I travel quite a lot. And conveniently, Martin Bryant's passport was discovered in the glove box of the yellow Volvo that was abandoned back at the toll booth. So very quickly, the police were able to ascertain that the identity of the supposed shooter was Martin Bryant. Soon after that, Martin's photograph was stolen from his house in Clare Street and very, very quickly, almost miraculously quickly, disseminated to all and sundry. So the police had a visual description of Martin Bryant, and they were able to attend the home of his mother, Carleen, and bring her in for questioning straight away. This is during the siege at Seascape Cottage. So this happened very quickly. Martin was arrested and taken to the hospital to be treated for burns that he had sustained on his back. While he was in the ambulance, one of the ambulance officers tendered a witness statement that Martin had said, "Where's Petra?" Petra was his girlfriend at the time. And the ambulance officer replied, "Was she with you?" And he said, "Yes." And he said, "In the fire?" And Martin replied, "Yes, we're always together." So Martin had made some claim that Petra was with him at Seascape, whether that's yet to be determined once again, but it was a claim that was witnessed by one of the ambulance officers. So there are some odd questions about the Seascape Cottage. Much later, when Martin Bryant, many months later, after being incarcerated and being treated for his burns on his back, was questioned about the events of why he was at Seascape Cottage and what had gone on, his only recollection was that he had some confused remembrance of kidnapping Glenn Pearce at gunpoint and putting him in the boot of the gold BMW. And this was at the Fortescue Turnoff Road, very different location from the toll booth entrance. And that he wasn't sure what had happened, but that the individual he kidnapped at gunpoint had a wife with him with a young baby, and that she told him she wanted to take part in the kidnapping, and he replied, "Okay, hop in." So his recollection was that it was some kind of a pre-established pretend kidnapping, and he wasn't sure how Glenn Pearce had died, other than that when he attended Seascape, there was some kind of explosion of fire, which is how he himself got burnt. That's the only recollection and the only statement and testimony that Martin Bryant has given that connects him in any way to Seascape Cottage. So, once again, without a coronial inquest or an open trial or a detailed examination under Royal Commission of the circumstances of the cottage, the siege, the people that may or may not have been involved, the activities of the police, I do understand that some of the radio calls and information that were coming in and being forwarded to the command post were erased by an individual. They should have been maintained and kept as part of evidentiary record, but that didn't happen. They were erased. Terry McCarthy, police negotiator, apparently was pretty upset by that some of the transcripts and the recorded information were lost and erased. Once again, needs to be determined. But there was some definite failures in processes there from both a police point of view and then follow on from an investigative point of view. So the siege at Seascape is an unusual one, and there are, in many ways, poses a lot more questions than there are answers. Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Wasp Files. Feel free to share far and wide and see the attached files in support of the episode. Thank you.